The branch Davidian story begins in the shadow of Seventh-day Adventism. In the 1930s, Victor T. Houteff started the Davidian movement, and in 1955, Benjamin Roden split off to form the branch Davidians, a millenarian sect focused on apocalyptic timelines. Vernon Wayne Howell, born August 17, 1959 in Houston, drifted into that world in 1981. He entered a violent leadership struggle with George Roden, and by the mid-1980s had built an inner circle. He legally changed his name to David Koresh in 1990 and claimed the authority to interpret Revelation. Koresh taught that he was a prophetic messiah tasked with opening the 7 seals. He preached sexual doctrines that included taking multiple spiritual wives and fathering children as part of prophecy, and those teachings produced persistent allegations of statutory sexual abuse that drew scrutiny from Texas investigators. Mount Carmel was an isolated 77-acre ranch near Waco, Texas, dominated by a large multi-story white residence with outbuildings, livestock pens, and storage sheds. Roughly 100 men, women, and children lived there under strict communal control, practicing communal labor, weapons training, and intensive Bible study under Koresh's intense, charismatic grip. Former members and relatives filed complaints and reported that children were being withheld, creating a trail of legal filings. Federal interest coalesced around alleged weapons violations. Investigators reported stockpiles of AK pattern and AR-15 style rifles, illegal short-barreled firearms, and the conversion of semi-automatic weapons to full automatic capability, evidence that prompted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to seek search warrants. Child welfare allegations added political pressure from local prosecutors and Texas Child Protective Services. By early 1993, the Justice Department had flagged Mount Carmel as a volatile nexus of criminal and protective concerns, and Washington authorized enforcement action. The mix of a belligerent, apocalyptic leader, a heavily armed communal compound, and mounting bureaucratic momentum set the stage for a confrontation federal agents scheduled for February 28, 1993. On February 28, 1993, in a pre-dawn operation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, moved to execute federal search and arrest warrants at the branch Davidian Mount Carmel compound, a 77-acre ranch outside Waco, Texas. The warrants targeted alleged weapons violations and sought the arrest of Vernon Wayne Howell, who had legally changed his name to David Koresh and faced related child welfare and sexual abuse complaints. ATF investigators, who had spent weeks gathering intelligence, believed the compound held an arsenal of semi-automatic rifles and illegally modified weapons. They planned a dynamic entry to seize evidence and take suspects into custody. The operation was tightly scripted. Teams assigned to breaching points, sniper overwatch, and armored support were arranged to surprise occupants before they could react. But the plan collapsed almost immediately. As agents tried to force entry, people inside Mount Carmel opened fire from windows, fortified positions, and brush-lined sightlines, turning the compound into a lethal maze of ricocheting rounds and splintered wood. What followed was a chaotic, bloody firefight. Agents reported automatic and rifle fire, burning powder in the air, and mounting casualties under intense resistance. 4 ATF agents were killed and several others wounded in the exchange. Davidians inside the compound were also killed during the gun battle. Ambulances and medics worked through shattered glass and smoking walls, while agents who had planned the assault scrambled back to staging areas. Faced with heavy losses, disarray, and an inability to secure the compound, ATF commanders ordered a tactical withdrawal and transferred operational control to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI established a unified command on site, set a ring of armored vehicles and law enforcement around Mount Carmel, and shifted from a short-term tactical mission to prolonged containment and negotiation. News helicopters and live television broadcasts began showing the compound's barbed wire, armored vehicles, and the gaunt silhouette of the white 4-story residence to a riveted nation. It was the kind of spectacle that made viewers reach for the remote and maybe click subscribe. The gory spectacle of the aborted ATF assault turned what had been an enforcement action into a national crisis, setting the stage for a 51-day siege centered on negotiations, surveillance, and an escalating clash between the apocalyptic sect led by David Koresh and federal authorities. For 51 days after the failed ATF raid on February 28, 1993, the FBI took control of the scene at the Mount Carmel Center near Waco, Texas, and settled into a grinding, grotesque standoff. The confrontation turned law enforcement into a spectator sport, and every word into ammunition. The Bureau's Crisis Negotiation Unit, led by Chief Negotiator Gary Nosner, opened a constant line of communication with Vernon Wayne Howell, who called himself David Koresh, and with his inner circle, including Lieutenant Steve Schneider. Negotiators spoke for hours each day, trading scripture, promises, and ultimatums as television helicopters circled and the white, multi-story residence loomed like a gnarled altar. Koresh wove every bargaining point into apocalyptic theology. He insisted he had been chosen to open the 7 seals, cast federal agents as persecutors, and used sermons to harden loyalty and justify keeping followers inside. Former members later described a punitive hierarchy inside Mount Carmel, with Schneider and a handful of loyalists enforcing Koresh's commands, men armed and drilled, and women and children sequestered, creating a claustrophobic, fear-saturated atmosphere where dissent was punished and obedience was sacrosanct. Negotiators made repeated attempts to pry people out. At times, small groups of children and a few adults were escorted from the compound and turned over to Texas Child Protective Services and FBI custody. Those releases provided fleeting relief and powerful television images, but they also fed the sect's sense of siege and the nation's ravenous appetite for spectacle. The media glare was relentless. Haunting images of children's faces, charred timbers, and barbed wire splashed across nightly broadcasts, amplifying shame and paranoia on both sides. Federal commanders balanced coaxing with pressure. The perimeter tightened. Resupplies were monitored. Many utilities were cut to isolate the compound, and behavioral analysts advised psychological operations designed to wear down resolve. Negotiators practiced patience and empathy to build rapport with Koresh while applying subtle coercion. Those tactics produced intermittent hope and repeated collapse. Promises to release more occupants were rescinded. Intermediaries like Schneider blocked deals, and theological injunctions were wielded like iron bars. As days bled into weeks, mutual mistrust calcified into implacable stances. Each failed breakthrough left both sides bloodied, furious, and one step closer to a violent, irreversible climax. The fragile cadence of negotiation collapsed into a grinding crescendo in April as legal, political, and tactical pressure converged on Mount Carmel and turned strategy into a deadline. Intercepted communications, court-authorized recordings, monitored phone calls, and audible exchanges captured on FBI bugs delivered contradictory images. At times, the tapes carried frantic, tearful voices of children begging to be released. At others, David Koresh and his lieutenants issued apocalyptic exhortations and commands that sounded like preparations for a final, murderous stand. Testimony from defectors, relatives, and tipsters only deepened the fog. Some former members said Koresh was persuadable and that families wanted out. Others said armed followers had been drilled and sworn to die with him. Those conflicting signals created poisonous uncertainty for negotiators led by Gary Nosner and for FBI tactical commanders, who heard the same tapes but drew different conclusions about threat levels and the chance of a peaceful surrender. Inside Mount Carmel, the branch Davidians were divided. Steve Schneider, a charismatic intermediary, alternately obstructed releases and negotiated terms. Family members pleaded with Koresh to accept offers, while a handful of zealots hardened around the idea of martyrdom. Every intercepted message and every wavering, hostage-like voice forced negotiators to recalibrate risk assessments and to multiply worst-case scenarios. Politically, the spectacle was unbearable. National media demanded resolution, Texas prosecutors pushed for enforcement, and Washington bristled at the image of a heavily armed sect defying federal law. Attorney General Janet Reno and Justice Department officials weighed legal exposure against the humanitarian impulse to protect children glimpsed in surveillance recordings. Tactically, the FBI shifted from patient containment to planning a decisive endgame. Planners evaluated the hostage rescue team, armored vehicles, and chemical agents. Psychologists and tactical advisors argued that non-lethal incapacitating measures, designed to force occupants out by disruption, offered a way to avoid another bloody raid like February 28, 1993. Commanders drafted simultaneous insertion plans and contingency flows, specifying routes, timing, and the use of CS tear gas to flush people into custody. Days of painstaking rehearsals, legal briefings, and escalating perimeter operations compressed into a single imperative: end the siege. By mid-April, the air around Waco was thick with surveillance, legal briefs, and a sense of foreboding. The tactical pivot, the fractured loyalties inside Mount Carmel, and the cacophony of intercepted pleas together made the final, violent reckoning on April 19, 1993 not merely possible, but tragically, terrifyingly, imminent. After a 51-day standoff on April 19, 1993, the stalemate ended in a brutal, mechanized crescendo. The FBI's hostage rescue team and other tactical units executed a planned insertion of CS gas into the Mount Carmel residence, while armored vehicles advanced under unified command. Commanders opened gassing operations intended to force occupants from interior rooms. Canisters and gas streams were delivered into the 4-story white building and its outbuildings as tactical vehicles pushed across the compound. Smoke and chemical irritant filled stairwells and hallways, exposing men, women, and children to choking, searing fumes. Within hours, those gas operations coincided with sudden fires that erupted at multiple points across Mount Carmel, turning timber and scattered belongings into ravenous, blistering infernos. Flames raced through corridors and across porches, windows shattered under heat, and black smoke billowed into a sky already stained by weeks of surveillance. Survivors and law enforcement scrambled. Some occupants fled the burning compound, while others remained trapped by smoke, flames, and structural collapse. When the flames died, 76 people were dead inside the compound, including David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell. The scene was grotesque: charred rooms, smoldering bodies, scorched toys and hymnals, and the acrid odor of burned flesh and wood. Almost immediately, competing narratives collided. Federal officials maintained that branch Davidians ignited the fires, while survivors, relatives, and some investigators argued that the FBI's tactics, the introduction of CS gas, and the mechanical breaching contributed to or precipitated the conflagration. Those 76 deaths and the sharply opposed accounts detonated a cascade of investigations, hearings, and bitter national controversy that would shape the aftermath. The April 19th blaze left a legacy as searing as its charred timbers. Multiple federal investigations by the Department of Justice, the ATF, and the FBI, congressional hearings in 1994 to 1995, and independent reviews that produced sharply conflicting findings about what ignited the fire and who was responsible. Prosecutors pursued weapons and conspiracy charges against surviving Branch Davidians, and dozens of civil suits by survivors and relatives followed, producing years of litigation, appeals, and contested settlements that never fully closed the legal ledger. The siege prompted concrete policy changes, expanded FBI crisis negotiation training, revised protocols for dynamic entry and joint operations, increased scrutiny of the tactical use of chemical agents, and tighter oversight of interagency command structures. Waco also became a grisly rallying cry. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh explicitly invoked Waco when he detonated a bomb in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people and accelerating anti-government extremism. Public debate endures over accountability for the burning, over protections for religious minorities, and over whether different choices might have prevented the deaths of women and children. Forensic disputes, contested recordings, and painful witness memories remain unresolved, leaving a national scar and a stark question. How should a democracy enforce the law without incinerating its own humanity?